Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast where we dive into all things Czech, history, culture, people and the stories that connect them all. I'm your host Vít Pohanka, and today's episode is again a bit different. I'll be sharing an interview that I recorded 2 years ago at the beginning of May with Czech historian Vít Smetana. At the time, I was just preparing this podcast and still figuring out the shape Czechast would take. Because of production delays and some second thoughts, I decided not to include the interview in the podcast at that time. Instead, I used a few short excerpts in a regular broadcast for Radio Prague International. But now, with this year marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, I felt it was the perfect moment to revisit that conversation, this time in full. Nearly 50 minutes of deep, thoughtful discussion about the war, its end, role of the American army, and what it meant for Czechoslovakia and the world. So, without further delay, here's the full interview with Vít Smetana.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Let me introduce Vít Smetana, a historian who specializes in international politics and diplomacy during the Second World War and at the beginning of the Cold War. Vít, welcome. And since we are both Vít, let me suggest that you can call me Vítek, so that the listeners and viewers are not confused, and I will call you Vít, okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for the invitation.
I should also add that you specialize in the relationship between Czechoslovakia and the world powers in the critical period between 1938 and 1948, but also the British foreign policy in the 20th century and Czechoslovak-British relations. Is that roughly correct?
That was correct, and I don't feel any need to add anything.
Well, if we can kind of set the scene first. Imagine it's the end of April 1945. The Soviet army has first encircled Berlin, then the city officially surrendered on the 2nd of May after extremely heavy fighting and bombardment. Hitler is dead, but the fighting still continues. What goes on in Czechoslovakia?
Yes, two large-scale military operations were just successfully completed by the Red Army on the Czechoslovak territory. After heavy fighting, we have to add, and with quite significant casualties. One of them was the Bratislava-Brno operation, which ended up by the liberation of the Moravian metropolis on the 26th of April. And further to the north, the Ostrava operation, which was completed on the 30th of April. But then the progress rapidly slowed down, especially in the area of South Moravian vineyards. And Stalin was getting increasingly nervous that with the fast advance of the US Army to the Czechoslovak borders, Prague might be liberated by the Americans.
So why did it slow down, particularly in southern Moravia? You mentioned the vineyards. Was it because the Soviet soldiers were kind of frequently becoming too intoxicated to fight?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons, but of course not the only one. There was some heavy fighting going on further to the west, and the progress was simply slow. But we have many reports about drunken Soviet soldiers. So it is fair to mention it as one of the reasons.
And let me just complete the picture. Slovakia had already been fully in the hands of the Soviet army, under the control of the Soviet army in the spring of 1945. And actually, the first Soviet troops entered Slovakia already back in 1944, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, Americans were originally not supposed to come to the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia. So how did Patton's Third Army end up in Pilsen and other parts of Western Bohemia?
Well, this is correct. The main task of the U.S. Third Army was to push as fast as possible to the southeast through the Danube Valley, all the way to Linz. That was the main target. However, while hiding its eastern flank, the Americans approached also the pre-Munich Czechoslovak frontier and crossed it on the 18th of April in the Ash Spurs. But they did not proceed much further because the main task, main goal was elsewhere, which I have already mentioned. It was Linz. One of the reasons of the main focus on the fast drive to Austria was to eliminate the alleged Alpine redoubt and to cut it off from the arms deliveries coming further from the Czech lands, especially from the Škoda works in Pilsen. However, by the end of April, it turned out that there was no Alpine redoubt and that there was no need for the Americans to assemble forces for being able to conquer it. And that revelation opened the possibility for the U.S. forces to advance further to the east.
Yeah, and that's what they did. I was just wondering, when did they come up with the line Pilsen-Badvajs or Plzeň-České Budějovice in Czech, which was actually the final line where the Americans stopped?
According to let's say a mythical explanation, it was decided in Yalta, but that's not correct. Czechoslovakia was hardly even mentioned in Yalta, and the military negotiations didn't come to any conclusion about the demarcation line. So, in fact, it was decided to set it up. According to the progress of particular Allied forces, and this particular line, Karlsbad, Pilsen, Badvajs, or Karlovy Vary, Plzeň, České Budějovice, was suggested by General Eisenhower as a rational, possible limit of the progress of the U.S. forces in a correspondence with the head of the Red Army, who was then General Antonov. And Eisenhower sent this message on the 30th of April. So yes, it was in the correspondence between Eisenhower and Antonov, and this line was suggested on the 30th of April. But then it changed. But I will get into that further
later on. Let me just ask you one question, which is not so much about Czechoslovakia, but I just cannot help asking it. Of course, there are various data about the losses of the U.S. Third Army while fighting the Germans, but it is overwhelmingly clear that American and other Western allies' losses were just a fraction of those of Wehrmacht, or the German army. Why was that? Was it just a result of the huge and overwhelming personnel and material superiority of allies? Or was it also because of different style of fighting on the ally side?
Well, there were several reasons, but it is also fair to say that further to the east, on the Eastern Front, the human losses of the Red Army far exceeded those of the Wehrmacht throughout the entire war. It had much to do with the limited respect to human lives, to say the least, in the USSR. And what certainly, back to your question, what certainly enhanced the losses in the case of Germany towards the end of the war, especially also on the Western Front, was the increasing hysteria under the slogan, "We are fighting to rescue our fatherland," which led to the mobilization of untrained or badly trained, insufficiently trained youngsters, or also old men. The other reasons were insufficient supplies of arms and ammunition, etc. Compared to the Germans, the Americans especially, but also the British, strove to wage the war rationally and to avoid heavy casualties at all costs. They were making full use of their superiority in arms, of preponderance in the air, which was quite remarkable, as well as excellent supply system and logistics, in which the U.S. Army was by far the best of all the war participants.
Now, let's mention one action undertaken by the US Air Force in the west of Bohemia that, at least later, became the subject of many discussions, not just among historians. On the 25th of April, the US Air Force conducted an air raid on the Škoda works in Pilsen, and I found this old newsreel in the US National Archives digital collections. Let's listen to it.
In a single raid on April 25th of this year, 8th Air Force heavies smashed Pilsen, Czechoslovakian supply point for the Austrian redoubt, where it was expected the Nazis would attempt a last stand. Battering these marshalling yards prevented vital shipment of materiel from Pilsen, last heavy industry area left to the Germans. 500 heavy bombers, escorted by 500 fighters, beat through intense ack-ack to produce this bomb damage. The Škoda armament works at Pilsen, seized by Hitler in March of 1939, was a prime target. This Goering-controlled armament plant made all kinds of guns, ammunition, bombs, mines, tanks, and armored cars. The plant, third largest in Nazi Germany, sprawled over 320 acres and employed 30,000 workers. 12 days after the attack that wrecked these Pilsen targets, the war in Europe was over.
So this is how the air raid was described by the US official military newsreel. What is certain, the Škoda factories were heavily damaged, but so were other civilian buildings, especially in the immediate vicinity of the city. Dozens of people died on the ground, several US Air Force bombers and fighter planes were lost, in some cases together with their crews. The communist narrative later on was that the attack on Škoda works was considered kind of useless in military terms because the end of the war was so close. According to this communist narrative, it was actually an attempt to weaken the future Czechoslovakia, which was inevitably becoming part of the Soviet bloc. Now, Vít, after nearly 8 decades, is there something like the official Czech historiographical explanation of that air raid?
First, I should say that fortunately there are no official Czech historiographical explanations of anything anymore. However, the research goes on, and I would like to make use of this opportunity to dispel this myth of the perfidious Americans who malevolently decided to destroy the core of the Czechoslovak industry, just on the eve of peace and at the very end of the war. We should bear in mind that Škoda works in Pilsen were one of the major armament factories producing many kinds of weapons for the German military effort throughout the whole of the war, and as such it became a target of previously as many as 13 air raids targeted against Škoda works and conducted first by the RAF, Royal Air Force. There were 7 air raids until the end of 1943. Some of them are quite well known because, for example, the one from early 1942 was also supported by Gabčík and Kubiš and Opálka, meaning those brave men who killed SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich later. So they were marking the corridors for the RAF bombers, but that was one of those air raids which failed. And there were 13 of them. Finally, on the 17th of April, the RAF bombed the Pilsen railway junction, which was also very important, and that was a successful air raid. And what needs to be stressed is the fact that when the major assault took place on the 25th of April, prior to that, an hour or so prior to the bombing, the BBC broadcasted a warning that the Škoda works would be bombed. Even Hubert Ripka, the member of the government who remained in London then, still appreciated that the warning was broadcasted and that it reduced the number of casualties. However, we have to say that, or we have to stress that the B-17 crews certainly appreciated the warning much less, because more than 2/3 of the B-17 flying fortresses were hit by the anti-aircraft fire. 190 out of 276. And 10 of the B-17s were shot down. 42 airmen died during the assault. On the other hand, civilian losses reached the number of 67, and only 6 of them inside the factory, which was comparatively low number. However, again, to set it into the context of the numerous attempts to bomb the Škoda works, more than 900 people were killed during the previous attempts to bomb the Škoda works. As I've said, it was one of the biggest armament factories of the Third Reich, and it remained so until the very end of the war. And what I would like to pinpoint further is the fact that as late as March 1945, the Czechoslovak intelligence service submitted to the Americans a highly appreciated report on what was still being produced in Škoda works, with the implicit suggestion that it should be bombed. This was in fact in line with other U.S. intelligence reports, according to which Škoda works produced, amongst other things, as many as 50 tanks per month. And it was more than reasonable to stop these deliveries both for the Eastern and the Western Front, even at this 11th hour. By the way, the Soviets did the same at the end of the war when they repeatedly bombed Vítkovice in Ostrava up until April 1945. So it followed the logic of war that armaments and weapons which were being used against the proceeding armies should be liquidated, regardless of the time and costs.
Well, firstly, let me thank you for putting me in my place and explaining rightly that there is no official historiographical version of any event in Czech Republic. Luckily, we do not live in a totalitarian regime that claims to have absolute monopoly on explanation what happened in history. But what I would also like to mention is, of course, I mean, there were numerous Russian air raids when Russians were attacking the German troops that were trying to flee to the west to get to the American prisoners of war camps and not to end up in the Soviet ones, because they knew they would be much worse. And just, in the vicinity of the town where I live, actually, in the Bohemian Moravian Highlands, there is a very small town called Ždírec nad Doubravou, where the Russians actually bombed the German columns and they killed quite a lot of civilians in the very last days of war. I think it was on the 9th or the 10th even.
There are numerous cases of this kind of Soviet bombing. Well, the most remarkable one was the one taken on the 9th of May in the large city of Mladoboleslav, which was bombed by the Red Air Force, and there were 450 casualties. And the only target was to slow down the German forces which were trying to move to the American lines. 450 people were killed. Quite useless. And from the ethnic point of view, about 150, if I'm not incorrect, were Czechs, and only the rest were Germans. But still, whoever it was already after the war. It was the first day of peace, and the Soviets were entirely ruthless in taking these measures which they regarded as correct. But it's really difficult to find a viewpoint or standpoint from which we could assess them as correct.
Let's get back to the overall situation. At the beginning of May 1945, the Americans are already in Pilsen, and there is a very kind of interesting episode, I think, because the US Army sent a special negotiating team to Lázně Velichovka in eastern Bohemia, where the Germans had their headquarters for the whole area of what is now the Czech Republic. Now, technically, if you look at the map, and I did so before I actually started speaking to you, technically it is more than 220 kilometers by road from Pilsen to Lázně Velichovka, and all this terrain was, strictly speaking, behind enemy lines. It was still controlled by the Germans, was it not? What do we know about that mission?
Well, the aim of this mission was to deliver the surrender signed on the 7th of May 1945 in very early hours in Reims by General Jodl, Colonel General Jodl, and U.S. General Eisenhower, with the participation of other representatives of the other fighting allies, including General Susloparov from the Soviet Union, even though he was later criticized by the Soviets that he shouldn't have signed it, but it was signed. and General Jodl warned that not all the German forces would be informed, especially those fighting the Red Army in the east. So the Allies decided to send a mission of like 12 vehicles to the headquarters of General Schörner, who was the head of Army Group Mitte, or Army Group Center, and so this mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Pett of the 5th Corps staff of the Third Army, and included also German Colonel Meyer Dettring. And so they departed from Pilsen in the evening of the 7th of May, and went through a long, as you pointed out correctly, a long way through Beroun to Prague, where they visited the Bartolomějská seat of the headquarters Bartosz of the fighting resistors in Prague, and then it was around midnight, and then they proceeded through Poděbrady, Chlumec nad Cidlinou, Hradec Králové, Jaromněř, all the way to Velichovky. There they negotiated with Schörner on the 8th of May, and then they retreated back to Pilsen, which they reached only in the early hours of the 9th of May.
You are listening to Czechast, stories from the heart of Europe. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and my guest is historian Vít Smetana.
Now, let's look at Prague. There was fighting in the capital since the 5th of May. The Czechoslovak radio was calling for help, among other languages, in English, hoping to get it from Americans who were already in Pilsen. And we can find this in the Czechoslovak radio archives.
Praha calling the Army of United States, calling the Army at Plzeň, at Pilsen. Send your army, send quickly your tanks, send quickly your airplanes. Prague is fighting. Stay free. Praha calling. Please send quickly your airplanes, your cars, your airplanes.
So a lot of people will ask, why didn't Patton and his officers do something? Why didn't they send troops to Prague?
Well, the answer is quite simple. He was not allowed to. Even though he very much wished to gain the laurels of the liberator of Prague, of the he was such a good commander, but he never had a chance to liberate any big capital or center. On the 4th of May, after it, as I've said, turned out that there was no Alpine redoubt, General Eisenhower sent another message to General Antonov that the U.S. Army might proceed as far as the lines Labe Vltava or Elbe Moldau, if you want. But unfortunately, that report or that message was formulated not as an announcement, but rather as a suggestion. And what followed was a strict rebuff, a strict disagreement from the Soviet side that basically they shouldn't do so because the Red Army operation aimed at the liberation of Prague had already started, which was not true because it really started only on the 6th of May in the afternoon. So when they sent that message, which was on the 5th of May, that was a complete lie. But Eisenhower simply didn't wish to have any international complications. He wanted to avoid them at all costs, bearing in mind that there were other connotations of that and other aspects which affected his position, such as thinking about the future of the war in the East. He didn't simply want to get into a conflict with the Soviets for several reasons. And he was backed by the following reasoning of the chief of the U.S. General Staff, George Marshall. And here I will quote, personally, and aside from all logistic, tactical, or strategic implications, I would be loath to hazard American lives for purely political purposes. Well, the irony is that it is very often presented as something which had been agreed in Yalta, and namely that for political reasons the Americans didn't want to get to Prague because Czechoslovakia allegedly had been assigned to the Soviet sphere of influence. But when we read this reasoning, these utterances, such as the one which I just quoted by General Marshall, we see that the logic was quite opposite. That the leaders of the U.S. Army didn't want any political aspects to be regarded as something relevant for their military decisions. Thus, the Americans simply refused to take these political arguments concerning the future development of Czechoslovakia into their consideration, despite all the pleas that they were getting especially from the British, from Prime Minister Winston Churchill through Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, several high Foreign Office officials, and even the British Chiefs of Staff, that they should really bear in mind that it might affect the whole future of Czechoslovakia, and unless the U.S. Army liberates the quite significant, quite important part of the country, including its capital, Czechoslovakia might go the way of Yugoslavia, which was then presented as a simple, communist conquest. But as I've said, the American generals didn't listen to these reasonings, to these arguments, and who could have changed their mind was the president, but unfortunately Harry Truman was in power only for 3 weeks, and he did not feel competent enough to give orders to his highly respected victorious generals.
Vít, I think there's one thing that you mentioned, if I remember correctly, even twice, and I think it's worth pinpointing because it's generally accepted as truth, and it is not truth, and that is the fact that the fate of Czechoslovakia was actually not decided by the Yalta Conference, the meeting of Stalin with Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the beginning of 1945. And if I remember correctly from the books that I read, if there was one country that was really discussed, it would be Poland and its future borders, and not Czechoslovakia.
The future of Poland was discussed there time and again. And so, well, we might get into details. It was the question of first the borders, which were previously discussed already at the Tehran conference, but also of the future government. A certain kind of compromise was reached there, which was, more advantages for the Soviet interests, but still it was kind of a compromise, which was based on Stalin's promise that if there is no catastrophe on the front, he would be able to hold general elections in Poland in a month or so, which was a shocking statement. But still, at that moment, the government of Poland was regarded as something very temporary, and so it was accepted that the previous Lublin government would be only supplemented by the representatives of the Polish underground and representatives of the government in London. So generally speaking, there were long discussions about Poland, but Czechoslovakia was hardly even mentioned. And what is very often presented as the major decision of Yalta, namely to divide Europe into spheres of influence, that is utterly correct. That is utterly incorrect. And we don't have any single document, any single relevant testimony which would testify to that mythical explanation of what was really going on in Yalta. The major outcome of Yalta was one of the major outcomes of Yalta was the so-called Declaration on Liberated Europe, which stated that the liberated countries should be allowed to choose their form of government according to their wishes and to the will of their peoples.
We were just talking about Poland. Now, if we look south from what is now the Czech Republic, there's Austria. And it was like Czechoslovakia in 1945, liberated from Nazis, both from the east by the Soviets and the west by Americans. Why did it not end up either a communist puppet state like Czechoslovakia or a divided country like Germany? After all, I mean, it was part of Germany, or the Third Reich, as it existed between 1938 and 1945. And Americans, as the British and the French and the Soviets, had their own occupation zones in Austria until 1955, like in Germany. Was it not so? And why didn't it end up like Czechoslovakia or divided like Germany?
Well, in the case of Austria, an agreement on the occupation zones, including zones in Vienna, was reached in July. It followed the pattern of how Germany had been divided into occupation zones right in Yalta, into occupation zones. And thus about 2/3 of the country were occupied, Austria, were occupied by the Western powers. And what should also be mentioned is the very marginal support for the communists inside the country. In the first post-war elections, they scored only about 5%. While in Czechoslovakia in May 1946, in comparatively free elections, and they received as many as 38%. It was even more in the Czech lands. It was around 40% in the Czech lands. In Slovakia, their gains were a bit lower, but still, in the entire country, it was 38% of support, which became, after which the Communist Party became by far the strongest party in Czechoslovakia, and it very much assisted the communists in their in their major goal, namely to get full power, full control of Czechoslovakia, which a program which they successfully completed by February 1948.
Let me mention one thing that I think is quite relevant and interesting in respect to Czechoslovakia and Poland, where I actually spent a few years as a correspondent for Czech radio. I remember that back in 2015, I was interviewing some people in the Krakow Municipal Museum, where they organized an exhibition called, somewhat provocatively, especially for the Russians, in Polish it sounded Wyzwolenie lub zniewolenie, which in English means liberation or enslavement with a question mark. And the idea was to show that for the Polish nation, the liberation by the Soviet army meant in many cases literally enslavement, because at least 84,000 Poles were arrested and sent to Gulag right after the war. And I'm not even mentioning the hundreds of thousands of Poles who were imprisoned by the Soviet Union before the Second World War, and then after it occupied the eastern part of Poland between 1939 and 1941 as a result of the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the agreement by which the Germany and the Soviet Union actually divided Poland into their own occupation zones. Was there such a sense of dilemma of this, liberation or enslavement in the Czech, Moravian and Slovak societies in 1945? I dare say no, even though there were some excesses by the Soviet soldiers, there were cases of rape. The Soviets were also known to kind of like bicycles and watches, which they often requisitioned or, put it simply, stole from unwilling Czechs. Nevertheless, the Soviet soldiers were generally and honestly welcome in Czechoslovakia as liberators, unlike in Poland. Am I right in that?
Yes, they were. But soon there came a painful sobering, to be honest. We have so many reports of widespread looting and raping, although we do not know the exact numbers, and we will probably never know because there are no sources for that, not enough sources for that. Judged by the quantity of documented cases from all over the country, it is clear that many thousands of Czech and German women were raped by the Red Army soldiers, and there are even dozens of cases of documented murders. Again, we don't know the exact figure. The deteriorating reputation of the Red Army soldiers was probably also one of the reasons why Stalin agreed in October 1945 with President Truman's proposal for a simultaneous withdrawal of all the Allied forces from Czechoslovakia. Stalin knew, after all, about the genuine popularity of the Czechoslovak communists, so he felt that he was not risking anything. He wouldn't have done so in Poland or in Hungary, where the popularity of communists was limited, to say the least. And he also wanted to present Czechoslovakia as kind of a showcase or display case of his alleged goodwill.
Well, I sincerely hope that we will get together again to talk about all the important events between 1945 and 1948, when communists finally did take over the power in Czechoslovakia. But let me ask you this. I am aware that some historians do not like hypothetical questions like what would happen if. Nevertheless, I can't help asking, do you think that Czechoslovakia would have a better chance to remain at least freer, more democratic and probably neutral country like Austria if Americans had managed to liberate Prague and occupy more substantial part of Czechoslovakia?
Well, I don't mind hypothetical questions if they are relevant, and whenever a personality takes a decision, there are always, it is always a junction, a crossing, and he or she has to think about the consequences of taking this or that course. So it is relevant to ask these questions, and I don't mind at all. And my answer to this question would be yes. Yes, I think that the chances for some kind of a Finlandization would have been much better, meaning that Czechoslovakia would have become, some kind of a perhaps a neutral country, which would have to be, friendly to the Soviet Union, perhaps bound by an agreement that it wouldn't enter any international combinations regarded by the Soviet Union as directed against it, or something like that, but with an internal democracy. The thing was that up until the coup in February 1948, and of course also later, the communists were successfully using the argument that the West only demonstrated its indifference with respect to Czechoslovakia in May 1945, as it had previously done in Munich in 1938. The distorted story of the brave defenders of Prague bleeding on the barricades up until they were finally rescued by the Red Army, with complete ignorance of the Americans in person, only strengthened the reputation of the Soviet Union as well as of the communists, who presented themselves as its major friends and agents, if you will. And this very much added to the pro-Soviet orientation of the so-called Third Czechoslovak Republic, meaning the one from 1945 to 1948. And all that paved the way for the communists on their march to power.
And let me ask you finally, I always want to keep a kind of tip for a trip as a part of this podcast, Check the Story. Imagine that you have some guests from the United States or from other, foreign countries. Which places would you recommend that they should definitely see that are connected not just with the liberation of Czechoslovakia, but with the Second World War and what happened in Czechoslovakia at that time? What would be your tip for a trip related to the Second World War in Czechoslovakia?
Well, there are plenty of them. Plenty of them, really. I don't know. I would probably take that person to the places connected with the assassination of Heydrich, the crypt in Reslova Street.
Yeah, that's very close to Karlovo náměstí or the Charles Square, right in the center of Prague.
And to the very place where the assassination took place, in the so-called Heydrich curve.
And that's in Kobylisy, Prague 8. Am I right?
Yes. And definitely to some places connected with the German terror, subsequent German terror, such as Lidice, which was annihilated in response to the assassination, even though that village had nothing to do with that. Also to Ležáky, which was more involved in the previous preparations of the assassination. I would also take him or her to Terezín, the major the ghetto and the concentration camp were connected with the Holocaust.
Yeah, Vít, and let me just add, just to make sure that our listeners know what we are talking about, because Terezín was actually called Theresienstadt during the war in German, and it was a kind of entry-level concentration camp. Theresienstadt was the place where people were concentrated, mostly Jewish people, but some other active members of resistance, for example, and then they were sent to extermination camps, mostly in Poland, and that means mainly to Auschwitz. Well, Vít, thank you so much for being with us, for talking about the story of May 45 in Czechoslovakia. And I sincerely hope that you will find the time in one of the next episodes when I would definitely like to talk about the events, how it happened that the communists actually took control of Czechoslovakia a few years after the war.
It was a pleasure for me. Thank you for this invitation, and I will definitely accept another invitation from you with a great pleasure.
So that was historian Vít Smetana, recorded in May 2 years ago, finally presented here in full as we mark 8 decades since the end of the Second World War. Thanks for listening to Czechast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing, sharing or leaving a review. It really helps us bring more Czech stories to the world. I'm Vít Pohanka. Until next time, take care, keep exploring and stay curious. Naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.